Hello. Assalamu alaikum, guys. I found the Sherlock game on mobile game. So, why don't we check it out, okay? It's called Sherlock Mysteries. What kind of story is up ahead? Let's check it out. Let's go. 4 cases. Let's just go to first case. Died twice. The man who died twice? Chapter 1. Bunhill Burial Grounds.
Keep up,
Early morning.
mutters Wiggins. The sooner we conclude our business here, the better. With hastened steps, we follow the flickering trail of lanterns deeper into the cemetery. The dancing lights lead us through a narrow corridor of stone tombs, flooding with the night's fog. When we emerge from behind the last mausoleum covered in brittle, dead vines, a tall, lanky silhouette lunges towards us. "Watch your step, Mr. Holmes." Inspector Gregory points to the excavated grave directly between us, then raises a brow in surprise. "Sorry, gents. I was expecting Mr. Holmes. Is he coming along?" Mr. Wiggins shakes his head as he takes a knee beside the grave pit. "Afraid not, Inspector. Actually, Mr. Holmes was a bit irritated you sent for him. He doesn't look well upon grave-robbing wretches." "Rightly so, gents, but in this instance I thought Holmes might reconsider, as the man before you is one Theodore Watts." Wiggins narrows his eyes. "Shall we recognize the name?" "I think not. But you see, Mr. Wiggins, the coffin Mr. Watts is resting on is his own. Theodore Watts, dead and buried 3 days past, November the 10th. I'd expect him to be in it, not on it." "That's interesting, Inspector. Well, we'd be happy to look into this on account of Mr. Holmes." The inspector nods. "Of course, your assistance is most welcome, gentlemen." "Any information on this Theodore Watts, Inspector?" "Apparently a partner in the speculation company, Strand Financial." Our meeting is interrupted by a drawn and tired voice of a constable. "We sent the old man to his quarters, sir. We'll get no information from him tonight." Gregory waves his man off, then turns to us. "The cemetery caretaker, Jacob Edwards. He was the one who found Mr. Watts. Said he heard an awful scream, and when he came to investigate with his dogs, saw a shadow rushing off through the trees. Claimed it was the devil himself, he did." "The devil gets the blame for the men who do his work," Wiggins replies, dropping down into the pit with utmost care. "This chap's had a bad go of it." Gently inspecting the corpse's head, Wiggins continues. "The neck seems intact, but the bruising is recent and severe. No gunshot or stab wounds. His clothes are muddy. Looks like he was digging for a while. Dried saliva around the lips. I'd say cause of death, tracheal rupture, leading to asphyxiation. How did you identify the body?" "Yes, pure luck. One of the constables happens to know him in person, and we already confirmed identity with the family. Imagine our surprise. I sent for Mr. Holmes immediately." Turning his attention from the corpse, Wiggins gathers a handful of papers scattered around the coffin. "Papers of the court, prisoner notifications and requests. Too old and damaged, but the name Kevin Brooke appears on many of them. The last one here is an article from the Times, nearly 20 years past. An announcement of commendation for excellence in prison reform dedicated to one Ebenezer Sallow." Wiggins pulls the papers close, examining a small piece of torn parchment, a list of 4 names, attached to the back side. Finally, Wiggins passes the materials to the inspector. Gregory shakes his head while reading the list of names. "None of these people come to mind. Oh, wait. Ebenezer Sallow again, and it is crossed out. This can't be coincidence." "And the coffin itself was empty?" "Yes. Mr. Watts, the man who was buried 3 days ago, was lying just beside me here when we arrived. The decaying body bore an unbearable stench, and I saw no reason it couldn't be moved. We sent it back to Sir Jasper Meek's at Bart's Hospital if you'd like to examine it." In reaching up to make his way out of the grave, Mr. Wiggins inadvertently grabs a hold of a shovel lying next to the grave. The handle slips free, sending Wiggins stumbling against the pit wall. "The tool Mr. Watts used to exhume the coffin." The inspector reaches for Mr. Wiggins. "Most likely, but broken in 2. How odd." The inspector's voice strains as he pulls Wiggins to the surface. "The murder weapon, perhaps?" "Most certainly not. The neck was crushed from compression, strangulation without a doubt. Our murderer is one jumbo bloke, over 6 foot and 200 pounds. Wiggins brushes the dirt free from his clothes. Was there nothing else to see when you first arrived, Inspector? Gregory produces a small red and gold brooch from his pocket. Only this. Intertwined letters H and C. The Hellfire Club monogram. That bunch is never a stone's throw away from a scandal. Wiggins examines the brooch in silence for a moment. Most peculiar. Then looks back to the inspector with a furrowed brow. I thought this Hellfire Club a mere group of bohemians. Hardly. We have quite the file on them back at Scotland Yard. Wiggins packs his pipe with tobacco. A violent encounter where our Mr. Watts, in his desperate final moments, tears away his assailant's membership pin. It's a theory. Now we have to see the facts fit. Would you gentlemen like to examine the Bunhill Fields burial grounds further? Mr. Wiggins lights his pipe. Not in this fog. We'll come back after it's lifted.
The victim was digging for a while. Cause of death, tracheal rupture, leading to asphyxiation. Well, I heard so much clues from the story itself. And here we found a couple of clues and a couple of names to lead on. Our mother is one jumbo bloke of 6 foot and 200 pounds. Not so many people, I guess. That meets the criteria. Let's take a look on the first clue, shall we? Broken soffle. Small drops of dried blood can be found on the soffle blade and shaft. What is that? The victim murdered by strangulation? Then why? That's possible. I guess it's someone else's blood. Or maybe, just maybe, the murderer. Yeah. Cold paper. Another Ebenezer salad. What's torn paper? Another Ebenezer salad. Okay, let's continue. In the first clue, let's see, Theodore Watts.
Our apologies to disturb you at this hour, Mrs. Watts, but if we are to catch Mr. Watts's killer, we must ask you a few questions. Mrs. Watts looks at us from behind swollen, red, grief-stricken eyes. Of course, of course. Inspector Gregory mentioned you gentlemen might be along. We convene in the study, which sits darkened save a handful of tall burning tallows. I'll try to make this as brief as possible, Mrs. Watts. When exactly did Mr. Watts first go missing? A long, unsteady sigh precedes the answer. 7 days prior. I knew he had financial problems, but he always talked about it as something that he was going to fix soon. His disappearance was swift, unexpected. I was sure he will come back to me, Mr. Wiggins. Yes, it was the evening of November 6th. And then they found a body. Staring through the nearby window, Mrs. Watts replies with a distant, removed look. At that time I believed my husband dead by such a dreadful manner. What could possibly be more embarrassing than suicide by gunshot to the face? We were already ruined. The funeral was private, family only, but some creditors somehow got the news and attended, to be sure. As Wiggins is about to press the next question, a young woman enters carrying a tray of tea and biscuits. As she starts pouring, Mrs. Watts speaks coldly. My chambermaid, Miss Lavinia White, gentlemen. Go on and leave it, Lavinia. We have matters to discuss, and the men can help themselves. With a curtsy, the young woman smiles and moves to leave the room as Wiggins continues. What about visitors or strange contacts? The chambermaid stops and looks back with wide eyes at the question. Other than the robbery, nothing. The chambermaid's mouth opens and she raises a hand just as Mrs. Watts turns and catches sight of her lingering. Lavinia, please, a little privacy. The chambermaid turns and dashes out of the room. Wiggins scribbles in his journal, circling a word with dramatic emphasis. robbery do you speak of?" Taking a sip of tea, she leans back in her chair and throws her head to the side.
"Well, it wasn't technically a robbery, as nothing was stolen. It was just yesterday. I'm not surprised you weren't told. I returned home from a visit with my aunt and found the front door ajar. I thought nothing of it, that Lavinia had simply forgot to lock the door on her way to the market, but when I entered I saw the entire place in shambles, as if a hurricane had torn through the entire house."
Mr. Wiggins' brows rise high on his forehead, as if someone was searching for something, yes?
"I couldn't say the motivations of the man. I can only recount what happened, Mr. Wiggins. That is to say, as I looked around in total shock, I suddenly felt the presence of something behind me. It felt very much like I had backed up against the wall itself, yet I had made no such movement. The next thing I knew, a tremendous painful pressure fell upon my neck, 2 hands choking the very life from me. I gasped and froze as a rough, strange voice whispered in my ear, 'Your husband is not fooling us. We'll find them. We'll get the documents. You can be sure of it.' I'll never forget those words as long as I live."
The teacup drops from Mrs. Watts's trembling hand. Taking her hand in his own, Wiggins tries to calm her. "Sorry, dear, that must have been an awful shock for you. Did you get a look at the chap?"
After he spoke the words, he flung me across the room, straight into a bookshelf. It was Lavinia who roused me some time later after returning from the market.
On the way out, we look at each other. Wiggins's eyes narrow deep in thought. "That chambermaid, Lavinia White. I believe it would be in our interest to have a direct visit with her at a later time."
It's the victim's home. We've interrogated his wife and housekeeper. A map of London showing where the house location. Oh, it's far from the cemetery. Let's look through the newspaper today. Auction of Strand Financial, eh? That man is really having lots of tips. The wife's telling the truth. Kevin Brooke, a name that mentioned on the scattered papers on the cemetery.
The chirping sounds of a piano playing Chopin greet us as we approach 39 Horseferry Road. Against the candlelight of a ground-floor window, the silhouette of a woman with her hair in a bun sits teaching a child the keys.
"Keep your fingers together and watch the bridge. Continue while I answer the door."
When she answers, Wiggins forgets his place and simply stares at the black-haired woman of his own age. After a moment, she smiles.
"Can I help you, gentlemen?"
Clearing his throat, Wiggins explains our intentions and the investigation at hand.
"I'm sorry, but I have no knowledge of this Mr. Watts or any of the associates you name, and I must be getting back to my student."
She tries to excuse herself, but Wiggins pulls off his hat and pleads, "We thought for sure you were connected to Mr. Kevin Brooke." The woman stops in her tracks, her face brightening.
"Of course I'm connected to him. I'm his daughter, Abigail Brooke."
"May I ask, where might he be found?" Before she can answer, Wiggins withdraws the news article and one of the prison requests. Abigail reaches for it, and Wiggins allows her to examine it. Within moments, her face draws tight and bitter.
"I'm sorry, gentlemen, but my father was convicted by this treasonous snake, Mr. Ebenezer Sallow. He died in prison shortly after his transport to Australia."
"Good heavens, I'm sorry to hear that."
Wiggins' sincerity is deep and genuine. "Well, you'd be the only ones. I remember my mother appealing to the courts for months, and not a single official would listen to her. My father was falsely accused and falsely sentenced. That Mr. Sallow was behind it all, the worst man England's ever seen."
Wiggins averts his eyes and speaks with clear discomfort. "Mr. Sallow is a respected and long-standing member of the Prison Commission, Miss Brooke. Perhaps the system itself was to blame, and not the unfortunate individual assigned to his case."
"You look like good, decent men, and I have nothing but respect for Mr. Sherlock Holmes. But if you've come for pleasantries about that man, you'll get none from me. He's a corrupt, vile man that stole and cheated his way into his position. My mother gathered documented proof he was bought and sold, sending innocent men like my father to the colony, all for pound sterling and favour. I would wish him the executioner's blade, but such a fate is too merciful for a man that has poisoned the lives of so many.
She holds up her hand before Wiggins.
I'll take my leave of you gentlemen now and return to my student.
Mr. Wiggins quickly snatches up her hand and kisses it gently. We're very sorry to have set you, Miss Brooke. I do hope you can forgive us. With a glow of anger, Miss Brooke closes the door and sends us on our way.
Ebenezer Sallow is mentioned again. I wonder why. This is maybe can include on his motivation. Maybe we can make him our first suspect. Once again, the map of London, far away from the cemetery. Okay folks, that's the end of our first glance to this game. Very interesting, eh? I believe it has no advertisement on the game. Go ahead and try this game yourself. Try to solve cases like Sherlock Holmes. Good luck everybody. Bye bye. Assalamualaikum.